They took his badge on a Tuesday, threw it in the dirt, right there in the middle of the street, in front of every man, woman, and child he had spent 31 years protecting. And not one of them said a word. Not one. That's the moment this story begins. Not with a gunfight, not with a chase, but with silence. The loudest, most brutal kind of silence there is. Stay with me. You need to hear how this ends.
If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside by someone who had money but no honor, Slay, this story was written for you. Before we go any further, I want you to do one thing. Go down to the comments right now and finish this sentence. I kept going even when.
Just 3 or 4 words, that's it. No rules, no pressure, just your truth. I read every single one. Now, let's get into it.
The day they stripped the Marshal of his badge, he stood in the middle of Dusk Falls Main Street while the whole town watched and said nothing. Not a single voice, not even a whisper. 31 years of riding through sandstorms, sleeping on frozen ground, and bleeding on courthouse steps, and all he got was silence. The tarnished silver star landed in the dust at his feet. Nobody moved to pick it up. The man who did it had smooth hands and clean fingernails. He had never once drawn a gun in defense of another person, yet somehow owned every soul in this small New Mexico town. He stood on the jailhouse porch with an unhurried smile, the kind that made a person feel small without a single word being spoken. "We thank you for your service, Elias," he said softly, like he was reading from a prepared card. It sounded less like gratitude. It sounded exactly like a burial. The Marshal didn't flinch. He was 58 years old, gray-streaked and sun-cracked, with a scar carved along his left jaw from a burning ranch fire 16 years ago. He stood straight, shoulders squared, eyes forward, but his right hand, the hand that hadn't trembled in 30 years of frontier law-keeping, shook just once, just slightly. Nobody saw it. Nobody in this crowd was really looking at him anymore. A young deputy stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in both hands, jaw tight as a locked gate. He was 22, freckled and fair-haired, still fresh enough to believe that justice had to mean something. He watched the Marshal the way a person watches a mountain collapse, stunned, helpless, aching in the chest. He wanted to step forward. He wanted to raise his voice. Instead, his boots stayed planted in the dust. He would hate himself for that silence later. The Marshal bent down, picked up the badge himself, and didn't put it back on. He just closed his cracked fingers around it and walked, slow and deliberate, like a man with nowhere urgent to be. But when he reached the alley beside the feed store, he stopped, reached inside his duster, drew out a brass pocket watch, dull with age and use. He opened it, stared at what was written inside the cover, then clicked it shut with one quiet, certain snap. This was not over. 20 years earlier, Dusk Fall had been a rougher but more honest kind of town. Honest, the way raw, unfinished things tend to be. It had no courthouse, no telegraph, and no law to speak of when the Marshal first rode in on a gray horse with a borrowed rifle and a letter of appointment from the territorial governor. He was 38 then, lean and hard-jawed, with black hair and those quiet eyes that took in everything but gave nothing away. The town didn't trust him at first. They tested him in the very first week when a cattle rustler, notorious and drunk, flanked by 3 loud companions, walked into the Sandpine Saloon and put a blade to a barman's throat over a gambling debt. The Marshal walked in alone. No deputy, no backup, nothing but the tin star and his voice. He talked the man down in under 5 minutes. No shot fired, no blood spilled, just nerve and the right choice of words. After that, the town breathed easier. Farmers left their gates unlocked. Women walked the street after dark. Children played near the creek without their mothers watching through windows with worry-tight expressions. The Marshal did that. He rode every trail, knew every family, remembered every name.
He kept a small leather journal, every crime reported, every grievance filed, every promise he'd made. He crossed entries off only when they were settled. He never left one uncrossed. Then a new man arrived in Duskfall on a Tuesday morning with 2 wagons of furniture and a stack of cash. He bought the old mill, then the general store, then the land beside the creek. He was charming and generous at first, throwing harvest suppers, paying off farmers' debts, funding the new schoolhouse roof. The town loved him immediately, and the marshal watched him the way a hawk watches a rabbit that moves just a little too carefully through open grass. He had seen men like this before, men who built goodwill the way others built fences, not for shelter, but for control. He said nothing yet. He had no evidence, only instinct, and instinct alone had never held up in any court he had ever stood in. So he waited, kept his journal, watched, and hoped, for the town's sake, maybe for his own, that he was wrong about Harlan Voss. He wasn't. He had never been.
She had lived in Duskfall longer than almost anyone, since before the war, since before the railroad rumors, since before the land had any proper name on any map. She was 54 now, auburn-haired with gray streaking through it, with strong hands and straight posture and eyes the color of river clay. She ran the boarding house at the south end of town and kept her business clean and her feelings even cleaner. She and the Marshal had a history that the town knew about, the way people know about old weather. Everybody felt the weight of it. Nobody discussed it openly. They had been close once, years ago, before duty and distance wore away what tenderness they had built between them. He still brought her firewood every October without being asked. She still left coffee warm on the stove whenever she heard his horse on the road outside. They never spoke of the past, but neither of them let it go, either. It was she who first brought him a name, not a rumor, a proper name with a date attached. A man called Decker Ewell had come through her boarding house 6 months prior, drunk and speaking too loosely. He had mentioned Voss, had mentioned a payment, had mentioned a man in the territorial capital whose vote could be purchased for $300 in a cattle contract. She had written it down on the back of a receipt and kept it folded in her apron pocket ever since. She handed it to the Marshal on a cold November morning, standing in her kitchen doorway with steam rising from a blue mug held between her palms. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and slid it into his breast pocket beside the pocket watch. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. There was gratitude in his expression, yes, but also something older and heavier, the look of a man who has just received the one thing he most feared finding, a reason to act and no room left to hesitate. "You be careful with that," she said as he turned to leave. He paused on her step, one boot on the ground and one still on the wood. "You always said that to me," he answered. She almost smiled. Almost. "You never listened," she said. The door closed softly behind him. He stood in the cold air for a long beat, let the chill clear his thoughts, then crossed the yard to his horse and rode toward the sound of trouble, the way he always had, without nearly enough backup and without nearly enough time. The evidence came together slowly, the way winter comes, not all at once, but in accumulations too small to notice until you're already buried. He spent 3 months building his case. He rode to neighboring towns, interviewed witnesses who had seen Voss's men burning crops on contested land, found a widow in Mesquite Flats whose husband had been shot for refusing to sell his water rights. He wrote her testimony down word by word in his careful, slanting hand. He filed his report with the county sheriff in late January, a thick envelope, sealed and hand-delivered. He waited 2 weeks, then 3. Then the reply came, a single sentence on a folded card, insufficient grounds for investigation. He read it standing outside the post office in the gray morning light. He read it 3 times, folded it, slid it into his coat. Then he walked to the young deputy's house and knocked before the sun had properly cleared the ridge. The deputy let him in without question. They sat at a kitchen table, and the Marshal spread out everything,
the notes, the testimony, the receipt, the folded card. He said little. He let the evidence speak. The deputy read every page carefully. When he finished, he sat back and rubbed his face with both hands. "Tatum's in Voss's pocket," the young man said, voice low and certain. The marshal nodded once, just once. "Who else?" the deputy asked. "More than you'd want to know," the marshal replied. They sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a dog barked and went quiet. The deputy picked up the widow's testimony and read it again. When he set it back down, his jaw was tight. "Then we take it to the territorial marshal," he said. The older man shook his head. "Voss got there first," he said quietly, 6 weeks ago. The deputy went very still. The betrayal had already happened, in rooms the marshal had never been invited into, over handshakes made before he'd ever opened his ledger. Voss had outmaneuvered him not with violence, but with money and patience and a network of people who owed him favors. The marshal had fought outlaws his entire life. He knew how to handle a man with a gun. But a man with a ledger and a lawyer, that was a different kind of war entirely, and he was already, quietly, losing it.
The frame job was elegant. He had to admit that, even as it closed around him like a steel trap. A slick accountant who had ridden in from Santa Fe presented the county board with a set of financial records. According to those records, $1,400 had gone missing from the town's public safety fund over the past 3 years. The records bore the marshal's signature at the bottom of every page. The signatures were perfect. They were forgeries, of course. He could see the slight lean on the capital letters, the way certain strokes ended with a short hook instead of the long sweep he always used. But handwriting experts cost money, and nobody in Duskfall was spending money to defend a man they had already begun to doubt. Voss sat in the back of the county hearing room, saying nothing, touching nothing, watching the way a man watches a fire he started from the other side of the road. The deputy stood outside the hearing room door, excluded as a potential witness, and listened to the muffled voices he couldn't quite make out. He kept one hand on his rifle and stared at the floorboards. When the door finally opened and the board members filed out, not one of them would meet his eyes. He looked inside. The marshal stood alone in the center of the room. The board chair set the silver star on the table and spoke 2 words: effective immediately. They walked the marshal out into the midday street. No handcuffs. Voss was too clever for that. A public arrest would generate sympathy and witnesses. Instead, they stripped the badge and delivered a quiet threat of prosecution should he interfere with town affairs. It was clean. It was surgical. The marshal stood in the sun as the crowd gathered around him and felt, for the first time in 30 years, something frighteningly close to fear. Not fear of pain. Not fear of death, fear of being erased, of everything he had done mattering not at all. That night, alone in his small house at the edge of town, he sat at his table with a single candle burning and the pocket watch open in front of him. Inside the cover, an inscription worn almost smooth by years of touch: "For the man who keeps writing." His wife had pressed it into his hands on their first anniversary. She had been dead for 11 years. He traced those words with one finger, slow and deliberate. Then he stood up, took his old rifle from the wall, and began to clean it, steady and unhurried, as if preparing for a hunt that had already, quietly, begun.
Real quick, 10, if you've made it this far, you already know this channel hits different. Stories like this one don't live on the algorithm. They survive because people like you choose to stay.
Haven't subscribed yet? Now's the time, though. Tap that button right now before we go any further. Because what's coming in the next 5 chapters? The Marshal isn't running anymore.
And I promise you, Hay, you do not want to miss the moment he turns around. Subscribe. Let's finish this together.
The deputy came to his door before sunrise with 2 horses, a saddlebag full of food, and a look on his face like a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the journey to start. The marshal stood in the doorway in his long underwear for a moment, looking at the boy. The dusty boots, the earnest jaw, the hand resting easy on his rifle. Then he stepped aside and said, "Coffee's on. You'd better come in." They sat across from each other as the sky shifted from black to dark blue to the first thin line of gold, and they made a plan in low, steady voices. The deputy had been thinking since the hearing. He had a cousin in Tucson, a newspaper man named Prentice, who had broken 2 corruption stories in the past year, and who had the kind of stubborn honesty that made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. If they could get the documents to Prentice without Voss's men intercepting them, there was a real chance. But the evidence was at the boarding house. The keeper had been holding the real ledgers, copies of the widow's testimony, and a second set of documents that the marshal had quietly duplicated before the seizure. Getting there without being seen was the problem. Voss had 2 men watching her streets since the hearing, sitting on horseback at each end of the block like decorative threats, not even pretending to be subtle about it. The marshal thought for a moment. Then he almost smiled, not warmly, but the way a chess player smiles when he sees 3 moves ahead. He had walked her street in the dark without detection for 20 years. He knew every gap and every fence, every loose board, every dog that barked and everyone that didn't. Voss's men were watching the street. They were not watching the creek bed that ran behind the boarding house. "We go tonight," the marshal said. The deputy finished his coffee and nodded without a word. That evening, before they moved, the marshal walked to the small gravel plot behind the old Baptist church and stood in front of a simple headstone. His wife's name was carved there. He removed his hat, stood still for a long minute while the wind moved through the dry grass with a low, dry whisper. He put the hat back on, turned away from the grave, and walked back toward the lights of duskfall with his shoulders set and his eyes straight ahead, and something burning quietly and sure in the center of his chest. The creek bed was cold, black, and smelled of wet clay and dead leaves. The marshal moved through it with the patience of a man who had spent decades learning how to become invisible in open country. The deputy followed 2 steps behind, lighter on his feet than he appeared, breathing slow and controlled. Above them, on the bank, cottonwood trees swayed in the thin night wind. Somewhere up on the street, the low, bored murmur of Voss's men drifted over the dark. They reached the back fence without incident. The marshal tapped twice on the gatepost, a signal clearly agreed upon beforehand, and 30 seconds later the gate swung inward, silent on recently oiled hinges. The keeper stood in the gap wearing a dark wool coat, holding a lantern with the shutter nearly closed, so only a thin sliver of light bled out into the dark. She looked at the marshal, then at the deputy, then back at the marshal. "Took you long enough," she said quietly. She pulled them both inside. The documents were wrapped in oilcloth and stored inside a flour barrel in the cellar. She had been thorough. Extra copies, a witness statement from a neighboring town's postmaster, and a letter from the widow in Mesquite Flats that had been witnessed and notarized by a traveling preacher 3 months prior. As the deputy went through the pages, his expression shifted from concentration to something harder and more certain, like a man whose doubts have been replaced with a different and heavier weight entirely. Then a knock came at the front door. Sharp, deliberate, not a visitor's knock, an announcement. The keeper looked at the marshal without changing her expression. "Back door," she said simply. The deputy was already folding the oilcloth packet into the saddlebag. The marshal lifted his rifle. The knock came again, louder. "I know you're in there." The voice belonged to the accountant from Santa Fe. "Mr. Voss just wants to talk." The marshal moved to the window and looked through a gap in the curtain. The man outside wasn't alone. There were 4 of them on the porch, armed, calm, not hired drifters. These were men who had done this kind of work before and did it without drama or wasted motion. The marshal counted them twice. He looked at the deputy. The deputy gave a single, small nod. They went for the back door, quiet and quick, just as the front lock began to turn. Outside, the creek waited in the cold dark. Above it, the stars were sharp and indifferent. They ran low and silent, and the night folded around them and swallowed them whole. They were 3 miles outside duskfall when the deputy's horse stumbled in a dry wash and threw him. He hit the ground hard, hitting his right shoulder first, then his head. He was conscious but dazed, sitting in the dust with his hat knocked off and his rifle somewhere in the dark nearby. The marshal dismounted quickly, knelt beside him, and ran his hands along the boy's shoulder, finding the joint had badly separated. The deputy's face was pale as chalk in the moonlight, and he wasn't making a sound, which was worse. The marshal reset the shoulder with 2 quick, practiced moves and a sound that made the horses shift and pull. The deputy didn't cry out. He made one low, grinding noise through locked teeth and then went very still. "Give me a minute," he said. The marshal gave him the minute. He stood and listened to the darkness behind them. Nothing yet, but Voss's men would be tracking by first light, and first light was maybe 4 hours away. There was no time for a long rest. It was only time for enough rest to matter. The deputy looked up from the ground. "You should go ahead," he said. "Get the papers to Prentice. I'll catch up." The marshal looked at him. "You'll catch up with one arm?" "I'll manage," the deputy said. "No," the marshal replied, and his voice left no space for argument. He helped the boy to his feet, steady and patient, and held his good arm until he was standing. "We go together." That was the agreement. The deputy wanted to argue. He took a breath instead and climbed back onto his horse one-armed, and the effort cost him more than he showed. They rode through the rest of the night, not at a punishing pace, but relentless. By the time pale yellow began to leak across the eastern ridge, they were 12 miles out, and the town of Crestwood lay ahead, chimney smoke just beginning to rise over the rooftops. This was where the deputy's cousin worked, where the newspaper office sat on the corner of 2 quiet streets. But as they rode in, a familiar figure was waiting on the step of the telegraph office, Sheriff Tatum, and he had men with him. Someone had gotten word ahead. Tatum looked at the marshal without warmth. "Elias," he said, the way a man says the name of someone he used to respect and now finds inconvenient. "You need to come with me." The marshal didn't move. "You been serving Voss so long you forgot what a badge means?" he asked quietly. Something crossed Tatum's face. Guilt, anger, some mix of both. One of his men shifted, hand drifting toward his holster. For the first time on the whole long ride, the marshal looked at the road ahead and wasn't certain they were going to walk out of this clean. What happened next happened fast. The deputy, one arm strapped tight against his chest, face still pale from pain, stepped his horse sideways between the marshal and Tatum's men with a steadiness that surprised everyone present, including Tatum himself. "My cousin works at that paper," he said, voice flat and clear. "He's already expecting us. The originals of these documents exist in 3 separate locations. You arrest us now, and those copies get published by morning." Tatum stared at the boy as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Tatum looked at the marshal for a long, heavy moment. Something old and complicated moved in the sheriff's eyes. Maybe shame, maybe the dim ghost of the man he used to be. His jaw worked. He looked at the ground. Then he looked back up. "I never burned anyone's farm," he said quietly, like those words settled something. "No," the marshal said, "you just looked away while someone else did." The silence stretched long enough to feel like a third person standing in the road. Then Tatum holstered his hand and stepped back. It wasn't justice, but it was a door, and a door was enough. Prentice was a small, wire-framed man of 40 with ink-stained fingers and an unblinking attention that made him seem larger than his frame suggested. He spread the documents across his desk without a word and read every page in sequence, occasionally murmuring to himself. When he finished, he looked up. "This is enough," he said. "I'll need 3 days." The marshal nodded. "You'll have protection?" he asked. Prentice smiled thinly. "I've published worse. Got a dog and a double lock." He was already reaching for his typesetting tools before they had reached the door. The story ran on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, it had been reprinted in 2 territorial papers. By Saturday, a federal marshal's office in Santa Fe had opened a formal inquiry. Voss's name was in print. His men's names were in print. The forged signatures were documented in precise, damning detail. The Marshal read the article sitting outside the boarding house on a Sunday morning, the first warm morning in weeks, with coffee going cold in his hand and something in his chest, very slowly, very carefully, unclenching. Harlan Voss was arrested on a Tuesday morning. The Marshal wasn't there to see it. He heard the news from the deputy, who had ridden hard from duskfall with his arms still strapped and his face split wide into a grin he couldn't contain, no matter how he tried. "They took him on the main street," the deputy said, breathing fast from the ride. "The whole town is out watching, every single person." The Marshal sat with that for a long moment. He thought about the silver star landing in the dirt. He thought about 31 years. He said nothing. He just exhaled, long, slow, and deep, like a man finally setting down something he had carried for far too long. A week after the arrest, the county board sent a letter, 3 sentences. It confirmed that all charges against the Marshal had been reviewed and formally dismissed. It stated, in careful legal language, that his service record had been fully restored, and in a third sentence, written in a slightly different pen as if added as an afterthought, it offered him his badge back. He read the letter alone at his kitchen table in the morning light. He folded it once, slid it into the same pocket as the watch. He didn't take the badge back, not right away. He walked Duskfall's main street one morning, slowly, the way he had walked it when he was young and new, and the town was a frontier problem waiting to be solved. He passed the jailhouse, the feed store, the boarding house, the church at the far end. He stopped at the gravel plot behind the church, stood in front of his wife's headstone again, removed his hat. Let the wind do what wind does in quiet places, move through things without apology. The deputy found him there. The young man had a new sling on his arm and a sheepish look. "The board wants to know if you'll come back," he said. The Marshal didn't answer right away. He looked at the headstone for another moment. Then he turned and looked at the town, what he could see of it from here, the rooftops, the smokestacks, the thin road running south toward open country. "What do you think this town needs?" he asked. The deputy tilted his head. "Honestly, someone who actually gives a damn," he said. The Marshal almost smiled. He did take the badge back, but not the title. He told the board he would serve in an advisory role while they found a proper Marshal, someone younger, with fresh legs and full strength. He recommended the deputy for the post without being asked. The young man's jaw dropped. "Me?" he said. "You," the Marshal replied. "You stood still when standing still cost you something real. That matters." The deputy opened his mouth, closed it, and stood just slightly straighter. Not visibly, but some shift had happened in him. They both felt it, and neither one mentioned it. On the last morning before he rode out of Duskfall for the final time, the Marshal stopped at the keeper's door. She opened it before he could knock, coffee already in hand, 2 mugs this time. They sat on her porch in the early light without talking, the way 2 people do when words have been used up, and what remains is just presence and warmth, and the particular sweetness of knowing that something was worth it after all. He finished his coffee, set down the mug, picked up his hat. She placed her hand over his for just one moment. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. He walked to his horse. He opened the watch pocket one final time, read the inscription inside, and clicked it shut. Then the Marshal, forgotten by law, remembered by the people who had lived beside his work, rode south into the open country, into the long gold morning, and let the road take him wherever it still had left to go. That's the last ride of a forgotten Marshal. A man they erased from the record, but couldn't erase from the memory of the people whose lives he quietly held together for 31 years. If this story moved you even a little, if you felt that weight, that silence, that moment when he bent down and picked up his own badge, then you already know what this channel is about. We tell the stories that deserve to be heard, and there are so many more waiting. Subscribe if you haven't yet, hit the bell so the next one finds you, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being forgotten is not the same as being finished. I'll see you in the next story.